Hey, Tuppy. How you doing this evening? Oh, Kiwi coming in with style with the raid. How are you tonight, Kiwi? Wise Penny, good to see you. Painted with style, pixelated. Tuffy is a mod everywhere. Yes. I think it's a rule. Like, if you're a Tlu 2 streamer, you must mod Tuffy. How you doing, Kiwi? Not bad. I had a rushed day, but I think I got everything I wanted to put in the slides and everything down. Hey, Santolo, how you doing? Welcome everybody who rated. Um, Hopefully, some of you will stay, even though even if you're not used to what we're doing here. It doesn't matter that it's class 5. We can still. I'm still happy to answer any questions anybody has. We're doing grammar for adults, which is basically teaching you how to analyze language in a way that's productive, right? We're not about, like, oh, this rule you must follow for your writing or anything like that. We're showing you the underlying principles of grammar, how language is structured, hoping to teach you something new. So, everybody had a good day, I hope. Please forgive me. I'm still finishing off my dinner. Just kind of waiting to see who else will trickle in. If anybody has any questions that came up, I'm going to review the homework first thing. But if anybody has any questions that came up, either just thinking about language last week or attempting the homework, this would be a good time to ask. All right. Well, I suppose in the absence of questions, we should just get started. All right, Kiwi, grab that food. Although, maybe I should wait to do the homework until you get back, because there's a reasonable chance that you were the only one who did it once again. While Kiwi is grabbing her food, let me just talk in general about what we're going to try to cover tonight. Last week, remember, we talked in general terms about phrase structure and how language is put together. This week, we are going to drill into one particular kind of phrase, the verb phrase, which you'll remember is more or less at the center of every sentence. Every sentence has a subject, a complete sentence has a subject and a predicate. Every predicate is a verb phrase. So verbs are central to language. And there's a lot of various aspects about verbs that we have not touched on yet. So we'll talk about, recall when we went over parts of speech, we talked about some different subtypes of nouns, right? We talked about how you have count nouns and non-count nouns. So we'll be looking at verbs and their subtypes, how they work for these things. We'll also be looking at what baby grammar books call helping verbs, auxiliary verbs to be a little more formal about it, and three very important components of verb meaning: tense, mood, and aspect. These are things that, well, tense is something that is likely familiar to you from whenever in your schooling you had these topics. Aspect, mood and aspect may not be familiar. They might, sorry, I have a little dog running around my feet there. They may be a little bit weird at first glance. They're things that sometimes get lumped in with tense, but they're distinct. So we'll talk about why they need to be separated out and how to think about it. And finally, we'll wrap it up by talking a little bit about how verbs are structured. So before we get to that, let me pull up the homework. We can start to talk about that. Let's see, where's the PDF here? There we go. Okay. So what we have here are the things that I'll put this, by the way, I'll put a link in Discord after the stream so you can follow it later, but let me just quickly go over these things, see if your intuitions and what you found match what I'm listing here. So for the first exercise, the job was simply to identify, we talked about phrase structure last time and how there's one word in a phrase that's the central word, we call it the head word, and that more or less determines the pattern of all the other elements in the phrase. And so play the game with gusto, right? Play is the central, is the head word, right? The game is what's being played. With gusto is how it's being played. So those are both adding different kinds of information to specify something about playing. Play is a verb, so the whole thing is a verb phrase. Okay? John's smug attitude. So attitude is the head word here. It's a noun phrase. Into the house, preposition phrase, right? A dependable student who always studies, noun phrase. And so on down the list. Does anyone have any questions on any of these decisions for the first 10? Excellent. All right. Let's see. Now, for the subjects here, or subject and predicate, I thought about sort of diagramming everything, but it gets a little too complicated. So, for present purposes, to do this exercise the way I intend you to do it, you really only have to identify the subject and assume that everything else is the predicate. Okay. In one or two cases in these examples, that's not strictly true, but we're not going to worry about that detail yet. So the first two are pretty straightforward, right? The tour guide. Yeah, exactly. These are Santolo, quite straightforward. The tour guide recommended visiting Yokohama. Tour guide, clearly the subject. Amazing proliferation of life. Inhabit, so subject, verb. That is the basic standard pattern in English. It's, normally what you would see. Now, number 3 is, a much longer subject, right? I don't know if everybody picked the whole thing. One of the things to note here is that this subject itself contains a subordinate clause. We haven't really talked about subordinate clause yet, but notice he would. So we've got a subject would become, we got a verb. So buried inside this, right? This whole subject, the head word is dream, and then it has a subordinate clause inside it. So the dream seemed quixotic, right? So that's a potential point of confusion for that, right? Also, who is the subject? Knew is the verb that goes with that subject. He was another subject-verb pair. These are in the subordinate clauses, so if you ignored them, that's fine. Now notice number 4, again, not a complicated sentence, but the subject doesn't start the sentence, right? That's what's different here. Many people, subject, are overworked with the hectic pace of life today. In other words, with the hectic pace of life today is part of the predicate. It's telling us when they are overworked. It's just moved to the front of the sentence. Regretfully, mathematics was never Peter's strong point. So again, mathematics was their subject verb. Regretfully, again, things other than subjects can open the thing. Now notice number 6, never had George seen. George had never seen would be the sort of default word order for something like this. But we have what's called subject-verb inversion here. And so again, subject doesn't have to appear at the beginning. Claire continued to date Henry in spite of many warnings from her friends. Just like number 4, we're opening with something other than the subject, right? What else did you expect to find? Question form, we flip did you did, subject verb inversion. We talked about that a bit last time. Again, I hope these are all pretty straightforward. This is meant to be, just confirm your intuitions. You're probably fine. If there are any questions on those, please ask. Now here is the more tricky part of the exercise, and this is how you diagram these things. We will refine these diagrams, especially the noun phrase stuff, starting next week. So don't get too wedded to this. This is a preliminary structure. But notice satisfied is an adjective. You can be very satisfied. And it has, I screwed up on the diagram. The P there, I'll post a revised version. The preposition there should be under the with, not as a separate head. I just noticed that. I was putting these together really quickly. All right. I'm not going to spend much time on these right now because I messed it up. I'll post a revised version for this. But basically, satisfied with the outcome is a preposition phrase. The outcome is the object of the preposition, right? Completely modifies satisfied, right? So, you have these things. Now, here's one that, notice greeted the dignitary at the airport. The key thing for this is to notice that the dignitary and at the airport aren't one phrase. This at the airport is where the dignitary was greeted. So you want to show these as two separate things, right? Um, you know, until the last syllable of recorded time. Notice so this is a big, massive noun phrase. The last syllable of recorded time. Um, the head noun syllable, right, has both pre-modifiers and post-modifiers. A long reply to the editorial, same basic idea for this. Other than the weird diagramming hiccup there with the preposition phrases, does anybody have any questions on those? All right. In that case, let's continue with today's stuff. So, let me get your opinion. Tell me for each one of these. That is weird, but you got all the part of speech right for once. Hey, Kiwi, like I said, practice results in great improvement. Just like with grounded permadeath. Right? So, I'm going to give you these one at a time. Tell me if you think they are grammatical or ungrammatical. Go on. She'll take you up. No. Okay. How about that one? Um, you think Reginald Primt is incomplete? That's not a complete sentence. Mm. I mean, remember we talked about the inadequacy of talking about an incomplete thought uh, as a way of defining a sentence, but um, Reginald Primt, you know, like I mean, you can imagine it. You can imagine a larger context, perhaps, where it would be sensible. Yeah. Um, I like that one. I think Reginald Primt is fine. Maybe I mean I wanted a verb. You'll see the pattern as I go to, but I wanted a verb that was related to what I was. The first one wasn't. Yeah, yeah. That's my intuition for this. With a very short sentence like Reginald Primt, you don't necessarily have enough context to really necessarily feel what's going on here. Maybe if I had said Reginald slept, it might have sounded better to you. I'm not sure. How about number 3? Okay. How about number 4? Number 5? Let's continue. This one? Good. Nope. Okay. Okay. Perfect. Your intuitions match mine exactly. No issues with that. So, yeah. What does this tell us? So, back up. Whoop. Backing up too far. Sorry about that. Come on. Okay. So, the point that these examples is trying to make is essentially that the there are patterns to the elements that surround a verb, the things that come in the verb phrase. And those patterns are determined by the individual verb that you pick. So, for a verb like neglected, it is not possible to just end the sentence with that verb, right? Reginald neglected is not a complete sentence. Whereas with primped or slept, you can do exactly that. You don't have to have something after it, right? And neglected his hygiene. Now this thing after it suddenly makes that a suitable sentence, right? However, we can't notice we can follow neglected with a noun phrase. We can't follow it with an adjective, right? Reginald neglected hygienic. But for a different verb, for seems, we can follow it with an adjective. Yes, exactly. Neglected what, right? That we want something else to complete it, right? So these different verbs select for different things that come after them, right? And then in the second page of these, right, neglected his chores. Again, we're back to the same pattern here. Neglected what, right? Now, and UK Chuck, how you doing? Good to see you. I hope you have not been neglecting your chores. I hope you've been packing. Now notice, excellent, good for you. Don't want to put it off to the last minute. About 15% done. I, of course, always put stuff like that off to the last minute. So notice we can put one noun phrase after neglected, but two, neglected his hygiene, his chores, we cannot do, right? However, there are other verbs where we can do exactly that. If you wait to the last second, exactly. Don't give yourself any opportunity to wait. That's kind of what I did with these lecture notes. I neglected to prep for this all week, and so this is what I spent my afternoon madly trying to finish. So, much more focused that way. We also cannot do another thing you can't do with neglected. Throw it in boxes at the last minute. Exactly. Who needs to organize anything? Just push stuff off the table or dresser, any surface you have. Just sweep it into a box, tape it up, sort it out later. And then, of course, you probably spend 2 years, 3 years unpacking, right? That's why I hate to move. So notice here we have his chores, a noun phrase, and then an adjective or adjective phrase. But neglected won't work with that pattern. However, with a verb like found, exactly this pattern is perfectly grammatical. Okay. So what all of this shows is that verbs come in different subtypes. There's different subcategories of verbs. And what we were just looking at with these verbs is something called licensing, or complement. The complements of a verb are the things that the particular word selects for. Yeah, the coffee pot. Without the coffee pot, forget it. Right? Important stuff. Stuff you need your first day. These examples are kind of more of the same, just so we can talk about them. But notice the verb use, you have to have something after. You have to have a noun phrase after it, right? Ellie used the gun, fine. Ellie used, no, not good. With fired the gun, though, you don't necessarily, you can do it either way. Ellie fired the gun or just Ellie fired, right? Both are perfectly fine. And then Ellie disappeared the gun? No, doesn't make any sense, right? Ellie disappeared works. Now, there is obviously the sort of South American usage of disappear, to disappear a person, meaning make someone disappear. But the gun doesn't work for that. So what we're basically saying is, depending on the choice of word, that determines what comes after it. That idea that particular words select for particular patterns is what we call in grammar licensing. So what we say is the gun, that noun phrase, is licensed by the verb used. And license basically means allowed, right? The verb allows it to be there. It selects for it in terms of meaning. And then any particular constituent that has this licensing relationship with the head word is called a complement of that word. So the gun is a complement of used or fired, right? Does that make sense? Is this distinction? I know this is kind of a technical term, but yes, more or less. Okay. Hey, Nikki, which sentence is correct? Hey, that is not what we're doing here, right? We're not. I mean, I mean, I asked you which sentence was correct earlier. But that's not an SAT style question. I can ask you those if you want, but we're not. This is grammar for adults, right? You all don't need to study for the SAT anymore. So, now, when we talk about something being a complement, a license, we mean that it plays this very specific role, right? The word, determines whether or not you can put it there, right? There are other things that will show up in phrases and clauses that aren't determined by the specific word. They can show up almost anywhere, right? And we call those things adjuncts. Adjuncts give you this extra information, right? They're not determined by the head word. So compare these things, right? In particular, look at that, phrase after Tommy left, right? That's what we call an adjunct. And the reason why we say it's an adjunct is it doesn't matter what verb is there. As long as the meaning is more or less appropriate, any type of verb will work. Now, I stepped you through a bunch of the types. We'll talk in more detail about what they are in a minute. But notice Maria was upset. So verb, adjective, right? Maria raged, verb, nothing. Maria questioned Ellie, verb, noun phrase. So, Maria gave Ellie grief, verb, two noun phrases. Maria found Ellie intransigent, verb, noun phrase, adjective phrase, right? So all of those patterns, no matter what the subtype of verb is, don't have any influence as to whether or not we can put after Tommy left here, right? It's just this extra information. That's the sort of thing that we mean as an adjunct. So, in general, the way to think about it is the complements are those parts of the structure that are grammatically specified. They need to be there. The adjuncts are all the extra nice to have stuff that may or may, you can put it in if you want, if it makes sense, but grammatically it doesn't have to be there. It still might contain important information, but we could drop that phrase or include it, and the sentence works fine either way. Yeah. Okay. Now, I have been showing you these patterns of verbs. Now I'm going to go into a little more detail about what exactly these patterns are. The first one you may well have heard of, even if you're not exactly sure what it means, and that is the idea of a transitive verb. So the pattern of a transitive verb here is the verb followed by a noun phrase, and we call that noun phrase the direct object, or DO for short, right? So Tommy killed Manny, right? Manny is the direct object. Now, the reason why it's called a transitive verb, I mean, maybe this will help keep it straight, is, this goes way back to Latin grammar. The idea is that the action of the verb somehow passes over, it transits from the subject to the object, right? So Tommy kills Manny, that action is passing over to Manny. That's it doesn't capture every use of the verb. It's one of those semantic things that's kind of fuzzy, but it can give you some idea of what is intended here, right? Direct objects are always going to be noun phrases, or nearly always, 99.9% of the time, they're going to be noun phrases. If you want to know if something is a transitive verb, if you're not sure, one really good test is to turn it into a passive sentence. So instead of Tommy killed Manny, right, the agent, the actor, is the subject, right? Manny was killed by Tommy. Now Manny, the patient, the recipient of the action, is the subject, and the agent is in the by phrase, right? The direct object of a transitive verb corresponds to the subject of the related passive clause. That's basically what's happening there. And I'm sort of showing you at the same time on the right the how this would look diagrammed, just so you get some sense of what's going on here, right? So notice, as usual, the clause divides into subject and predicate, right? The subject is just pretty simple. And then the predicate, so we have the verb, and I'm adding a T to show that it's a transitive verb. You don't have to do that. Apply, and then we have the direct object, the effort, right? If I'm going to assume, I'm going to stop saying, are there any questions? If anybody has any questions, do not hesitate just to drop something in chat, and then I will stop and deal with it. All right. Now, we were just talking about direct objects. More generally, direct object is one particular kind of object. There's a couple of others, right? But in general, it's a type of complement, right? So it's licensed by a word. The ones we're looking at here are licensed by verbs in particular. Objects are almost always noun phrases, Some verbs require them, but not all verbs. I already mentioned this, corresponds to the subject of related passive, right? So this is a general, and often, in most cases, you can substitute out for that whole noun phrase, you can just substitute one pronoun, and that will work just fine, right? Also, in the standard basic clause, direct objects come right after the verb, in English at least. All right. Now, consider this. Tommy gave Manny a facial. So notice this Manny a facial is not one phrase, right? Yes. With a certain definition of facial. And we can tell it's not one phrase. If it's not intuitively obvious that that's two separate phrases, notice that we can rearrange the sentence so that the so that the two parts sort of separate from each other, right? We could say Manny was given a facial by Tommy, right? We can move that separately. You can say a facial was what Tommy gave Manny, right? In other words, we can rearrange things separately. If this were one single phrase, it would let us move it as a unit. But notice we can't say Manny a facial was what Tommy gave, right? That one doesn't really work. So the pattern here, notice Tommy gave a facial. The facial is the thing that's being directly given. That's why we call it the direct object, right? What we call the role that we say Manny plays in this sentence is as an indirect object, right? Manny is receiving the direct object, and that is the role of the indirect object. It's the recipient of the action. Hey, Kim, how you doing? Welcome in. How are you this evening? Not bad. We're just getting started, really, with everything. Talking about different kinds of verbs here. Dustin is in the air. Oh, well, hope the rest of his trip goes smoothly and safely. Just see. There we go. I don't have enough room on my, despite the fact that I have two monitors, one of which is a very large format 4K monitor, I still don't have enough screen real estate for everything I want to see simultaneously here. Okay. So Manny is the indirect object. Indirect objects are always the recipient of the action. For those of you who know a language that has a richer system of cases than English does. So, for example, if anybody in here knows German, or Latin for that matter, or I presume Greek, I haven't seen So say hello, so I don't think he's here. Yeah, you know some German. So, the indirect object in a lot of languages that are, a lot of Indo-European languages especially, takes what's called the dative case, right? Which is something that used to be in English. It dropped out of the language in early Middle English, but You mark the case ending on these nouns is different when it plays this kind of role, the indirect object role, than it is when it plays the direct object role. The accusative case is what's used in these languages for direct object, dative for indirect. And it's more complicated than that, but that's the basic idea. Now, a lot of these verbs that have we call them ditransitive, di for two. So they have two objects, right? Indirect, direct. Indirect always comes first. A lot of these verbs have an alternative form. Tommy gave a facial to Manny. Traditional grammar books tend to call to Manny the indirect object. However, it's not really. Remember what we said before. Indirect objects need to be, or objects of all types, need to be noun phrases. Preposition phrases are not objects. The thing that's happening here, the to Manny, has the same semantic function. Remember we talked about semantic roles last week? Like agent or patient or instrument, these different roles that the various phrases are playing. So when we talk about Manny here, in the first version as the actual indirect object, that's the recipient of the action. And to Manny also marks a recipient, right? But by itself, that role is not enough for us to call it an indirect object. And the reason why it's not, you can see if you think about how we treat subjects, right? What's the subject of the version at the bottom? Manny was given a facial by Tommy. Hey, Mrs. Smarty Pants. You walked into me using a somewhat gruesome example from The Last of Us 2. At least gruesome if you know the story of the game. If you don't know the story of the game, you might assume that this guy Manny is just, or Tommy and Manny are best buds, and Tommy is giving Manny a little bit of skincare treatment. Anyway, so what's the subject of the bottom example? Facial is the subject. So if anybody's uncertain, remember I gave you a test last week. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? For how to find a subject in a sentence, right? Remember that property. If you compare a statement form of a sentence with the equivalent yes/no question formed out of that statement, what you find is that verb, that helping verb, or what's called an operator sometimes, moves around the sentence, moves around the subject from one side to the other. So what's the yes/no question for this sentence? Hey, Shirei, thanks for the lurk. I hope my question makes sense. What I'm asking basically is, um, if we take that Manny was given a facial by Tommy and transform that into a question that has a yes or no answer, what would that question look like? Um, so yeah, you're pretty close, Kiwi. I mean, facial can be moved, but that's not the question I was asking. I mean, you can move around various parts of the sentence, um, and that's a useful way to test various things. So that is a yes/no question, Santolo. Did Manny get a question? But what when I'm talking about transforming it, I mean maybe I wasn't clear enough about this, and I apologize. What I mean is take the exact words you're given and rearrange them to turn it into a yes/no question. Yes, Kiwi, exactly right. Was Manny given? Now you could say was a facial given, right? That's true. But now notice you've dumped Manny and Tommy. You've changed the order of everything, right? So notice we have the difference we have is between Manny was given and leave everything else the same, or was Manny given, and so on, right? Um, so when we do that exercise, where we're not rewriting the sentence except just to sort of move the verb to transform it into a question, you can see that the that was is on the right side of Manny in the statement form and on the left side in the question form. And this is strong evidence that, in fact, is conclusive evidence that Manny here is the subject. Okay. Does that make sense? Do you understand the distinction I'm making between this and the rewritten? Was a facial given to Manny by Tommy? Yes. Now, notice you've rewritten the sentence, though, because if we do the minimal transformation, I mean, this is the sort of stuff that yeah, Manny does not exactly. The statement equivalent, the exact statement equivalent, Santolo, to what you just wrote is this: a facial was given to Manny by Tommy. Okay. So in this version, a facial is absolutely the subject, right? But that's not the version we're looking at, right? We're looking at Manny was given a facial by Tommy. And as Kiwi points out, that you had to get that transformation, you had to insert an extra two. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So the reason why I gave you this example and why I asked you what the subject of this was is notice Manny was given a facial by Tommy is the grammatical subject, right? However, it's also the recipient of the action. And it's a passive voice verb clause, so that's kind of what you expect. We don't say that Manny is the indirect object in the very top example and still the indirect object in the bottom example, right? In other words, no matter how traditional a grammarian is, they'll all say that Manny is the subject in the bottom example. So, therefore, what we're essentially saying is the role that the semantic role that the phrase has in the sentence isn't enough to, yes, Manny receives quite a remake for his face. Yeah, two exists in the second one. Exactly. But notice, it goes too many, right? A facial was given too many by Tommy. This actually brings up a second point, which is, well, we haven't really talked about passive voice in any detail, but when you have a ditransitive verb, you can generally make either the indirect object or the direct object the subject in a passive voice equivalent, right? So Manny was given a facial by Tommy is one way to make it passive, and the other way is a facial was given to Manny by Tommy, right? It's two various things, but in each case, you're moving a different phrase into the subject position, right? So my point here is that traditional grammar books will call, in the middle example, will call too many an indirect object. But there's no really good reason to call it that. It's got the same semantic function, but nowhere else in grammar, even very traditional grammar, do we call something, different things in different places because it has the same semantic role. Hence what I was talking about with the subject. Right? And that example, this whole example, like the digression we got in understanding it, had very little to do with why I gave you the example, but I'm actually glad that we kind of worked through this, because, being able to consistently recognize a subject in a sentence is a really important basic skill of analyzing language, right? So you really have to understand what is going on here. Right? So ditransitive verbs have a direct object, and they're still a transitive verb because they have a direct object, but they also have a second noun phrase and indirect object, right? We would call, by the way, because of the way I'm defining this stuff, Tommy gave a facial to Manny. That's a single ordinary transitive verb that also happens to have a preposition phrase in it, right? And this is how you would diagram a sentence like this. So notice the indirect object and the direct object are two separate phrases that are both inside the verb phrase. Any questions about why I diagrammed it this way? Okay. If a verb does not have a direct object after it, if it's just verb only, right, then we call it an intransitive verb, not transitive, right? So in other words, transitive verbs are defined by what they have after them. Intransitive verbs are defined by what they don't have. No direct object, it's not a transitive verb, right? So Bill objected. We can end it. Dina slept in the theater lobby. Now notice we're not ending the sentence with the verb here, but in the theater lobby is an adjunct, right? Preposition phrases, as we saw with the indirect object thing, are not objects, right? They're extra things. Notice we could just say Dina slept if we wanted. Adding in the lobby, that's extra stuff, right? So when you have an intransitive verb, you may well have a one-word verb phrase, right? An outcry arose, period, right? So that's all one-word predicate. That's all you got. All right. The basic idea is those transitive and intransitive ones, those are the most straightforward verb types. Next, we have something that gets slightly more complicated, not hugely, but a few things. So compare or take a look at this pattern, right? We still have a subject, we still have a verb. It's still followed by, well, the first example at least is followed by a noun phrase, right? However, the way that this relates to the subject is different from what we saw with transitive verbs. Does anybody have an idea of how it might be different? Hey, Mickey. So the question is, we're looking at these examples. Joel was a smuggler. Ellie became enraged. We've already looked at We've already looked at transitive verbs, right? So, like, I don't know, Joel saw the smuggler. And so my question was, how does the relationship between a phrase like a smuggler and this verb differ from the transitive verbs that we were looking at? Right. And I accidentally hit the next thing, so this may kind of give you an answer. But look at the difference. Compare these two. Abby became a soldier. Abby greeted a soldier. What's different about the role that a soldier plays in each sentence? Precisely so, Mickey. Yes. So when it's Abby became a soldier is specifying something about Abby, right? Abby greeted a soldier, two separate things, right? The action, and so the second one we call a transitive verb, has a direct object. That's something separate from the subject. It is describing, yes, a soldier is describing the subject here. Okay. Or renaming it if you prefer. Something like that. So now this linking verb is a kind of intransitive verb. Notice a soldier here is not a separate object. It's not a direct object. Therefore, it's it's an intransitive verb, but it's a complex intransitive verb because it does have something else after it. What we call that something else on the top, it's traditionally called a subject complement, or more generally a predicative complement. Predicative meaning it predicates something. In other words, remember the definition of predicate: to predicate something is to make an assertion about something. So it's describing the subject. It's asserting a condition of the subject. It's traditionally called a subject complement because it refers to the subject. Imagine, and they're called linking verbs because the function of the verb is primarily to create a link, a direct link between the meaning of the subject and the meaning of that complement. Right? The second example, Ellie became enraged, shows you that unlike the case of direct objects, these complements can also be adjective phrases, right? Ellie became enraged. Enraged is an adjective, so that's an adjective phrase. That works fine as well, right? You can't do that with the transitive verb, right? You couldn't say Abby greeted enraged. One other small difference, there's some other differences between these complements and objects, just by way of trying to convince you that they really are two separate things. Notice that you can say Obama became president, right? That is, president there is the subject complement. It's describing Obama. But president by itself as a singular noun, phrase, in most circumstances doesn't work, right? You can't say I saw president. It has to be I saw the president. A noun phrase there without a determinative is called, or determiner is called a bare role noun phrase, right? Where you just have only the noun and nothing else. That's only possible with a subject complement, right? You can't do it with when it's a direct object or things like that. So these differences are just ways of showing it's not just an arbitrary difference here. There are real grammatical things that vary depending on whether we have an object or a subject complement. Does this idea of linking verbs make sense to anyone? Anybody have any questions before I move on? Here are two ways of showing what's going on here, right? With these linking verbs, right? Lewis remained an obstinate man, right? PC for predicative complement. It's just telling you what kind of man Lewis was, right? The president looked haggard. There it is with an adjective phrase instead of a noun phrase, but it's the same basic idea. All right. Now consider this one. The fireflies considered Phaedra the enemy. Or the present made her happy. Now, is Phaedra the enemy one phrase or two separate phrases? It's two phrases. And we can do some tests if we're not convinced. Try that passive thing, right? Phaedra was considered the enemy by the fireflies, right? They move separately, right? The enemy was what the fireflies considered Phaedra. So we can rearrange things, and they move separately when we do that. So they're two separate phrases. Now, is Phaedra, we got two noun phrases after a verb. So the first thing you're probably thinking there is we got another ditransitive thing. And remember, the pattern there is indirect object followed by direct object. So is Phaedra, can we analyze Phaedra as the indirect object of this and the enemy as the direct object? Does that make any sense? Remember, indirect objects receive the direct object. Is Phaedra in this sentence receiving an enemy? You think so. So the enemy is something. Phaedra is the enemy, Kiwi. Yeah. The enemy is not something, is not a separate thing that Phaedra is getting. Like, here, Phaedra, let me give you the enemy, right? Phaedra is the enemy, as Kiwi puts it. Okay. It's part of the same thing. Exactly. So even though grammatically these are two separate objects, they move on their own, or complements, or constituents, I should say, right? They're not, they're not actually distinct from each other. In other words, the enemy renames or is descriptive of Phaedra. Receiving as an adjective. I get you. I get you, Mickey. I understand. In other words, if this looks a lot like a linking verb that we just saw, that similarity is no accident. This is more or less exactly the same pattern that we saw with linking verbs, but instead of the second thing adding descriptive information about the subject, in this case, it's adding it about the direct object. Right? And the traditional term, this is, in other words, just like the linking verbs, this is a predicative complement. In traditional grammar, it's usually called the object complement because it renames or adds descriptive information to the object, right? Notice the second example. The present made her happy, right? So happy is a quality applied to her. Right? And also notice, just like the linking verb, it can be either a noun phrase as the complement or an adjective phrase, right? Both there. Okay. Any questions? These patterns that I've showed you, there's like these 5 basic patterns, are the most common subtypes that of verbs that you're going to see. There are some others. They're a little bit, they're rarer. I mean, not rarer in the sense that there aren't nearly as many verbs that use those patterns. Some of these patterns show up a lot with, common verbs that you use every day. And we can talk about them if we run across one of them. But these are if you understand these basic patterns, you will get the majority of the concepts that we have to deal with with these verb subtypes and the verb phrase pattern. And here's how you would diagram something like this, right? So calls teenagers. What does he call them? So blithering idiots are a quality of being a teenager, at least according to my grandfather. Apologize to anybody who's a teenager in the audience. Don't take it personally. So this is sort of what, just to give you a reminder of the verb types that we were talking about. Yeah, well, we all were at one point, weren't we? We were all blithering idiots at some point, I suppose. This is not a phrase structure diagram. This is just a way of sort of showing you visually how all these types are related to each other, right? So, within verbs, we have transitive and intransitive verbs, right? That division is based entirely on whether or not they have a direct object. If they have a direct object, they're transitive. And then we have those that just have the one object, monotransitive verbs, right? A simple one, nothing else, just the direct object. So, I walked the dog, right? That's it. Just the dog, one direct object, that's it, right? The dog, let's see, I consider the dog my friend, right? Dog, my friend, that's a complex transitive verb. Monotransitive, one object, right? Predicative complement. Ditransitive, that's the give pattern, right? Give him a chance, something like that. Intransitive can be the simple one where it just ends with nothing else except maybe an adjunct. And then the complex one, which is the linking verb, where you have the predicative complement. Okay. So those 5 types are what you want to know to understand the vast majority of the way verb phrases are structured. Before we go on, I want to come back, since we've been looking at these various things, I want to come back to a little bit about how do you tell the difference between a complement and an adjunct, right? When I was telling you about the idea that complements are licensed and adjuncts are not licensed, that's a very technical way of putting it. It's really easy to lose track of exactly what that means, right? So a couple of examples just to start us off, right? What are the roles here, right? She fed the dog, so that's all the same. But then freshly cooked chicken versus Thursday morning, right? Notice in both cases, these are noun phrases, right? But what role do each of these play? Dogs like Thursdays. Hey, Benz, how you doing? Dog is eating Thursday morning. Everything tastes like chicken, doesn't it? Yeah, what versus when is a good way to put it, Huey? Exactly. So, here's the test. Notice this, she fed the dog freshly cooked chicken. So in this case, the dog is receiving the freshly cooked chicken. That's a ditransitive verb. In other words, we have an indirect object followed by a direct object. But notice the dog is, unless you interpret it the way Binns was suggesting, interpreted in the natural way, the dog isn't, Thursday morning isn't something that you're giving the dog, right? For food, right? Whether it tastes like chicken or not. And in fact, Thursday morning is one of those optional things, right? It's just an adjunct. And one way we can tell is by using do so as a test. So notice the patterns here. Remember, do so is, hey, Tolo, or no, wait, what am I doing? Tolo's been here all along. Binns is just greeting Tolo. Sorry about that. I just saw Tolo and I thought, oh, must have just come into chat, but nope. So do so, which I think I might have mentioned in passing before, is an expression which is used to replace a verb phrase, or parts of a verb phrase anyway. But notice it only replaces part of the stuff, right? So she fed the dog freshly cooked chicken yesterday, and I did so today. So notice, what is did so replacing? It's replacing fed the dog freshly cooked chicken, right? The yesterday and today are sort of occupying the same slot in the sentence, right? We're swapping one for the other to make the contrast, right? We can also do it, notice she fed the dog Thursday morning and I did so this evening. So did so in the second example replaces fed the dog, right? However, she fed the dog Thursday morning and I did so. Can I use what as a test? She fed the dog what? Freshly cooked chicken. Versus she fed the dog what? Thursday morning. Does that only work here? It works. It works because, but I think it works for incidental reasons. If I worked hard enough, I can't think of a counterexample off the top of my head. It works because what characteristically is, I mean, what is a pronoun? It's replacing a noun phrase, but it's replacing one that is what is used for like objects. So it's not going to replace like Thursday morning, which is it's still a noun phrase, but it's functioning to indicate time. So you wouldn't use what for that, right? All right, Mickey. See you in a bit. Yeah. So and the other thing is what also replaces things other than objects. So it's not like it can replace subjects and other things. So it kind of works. My point here, notice, I should have, I only starred the third example. The fourth example should be starred as well, because the third and fourth examples are wrong. She fed the dog Thursday morning, and I did so. Notice, what does that tell us? The fact that it's ungrammatical tells us did so cannot replace everything fed the dog Thursday morning, right? It only replaces fed the dog in that case. And notice we can't say she fed the dog Thursday morning and I did so the cat, right? So and I did so the cat Thursday evening. It doesn't work. So the did so must include all of the complements, and it must not include any of the adjuncts, right? In other words, all of the complements go along for the ride there, and none of the adjuncts do, which makes this a very nice, elegant way of distinguishing between the two things. At least when we're talking about complements and adjuncts inside a verb phrase, right? It's not the only place they appear. All right. I want to start to talk a little bit about tense. Don't get tense. Don't worry. However, I hope by the end of this to convince you that most of what you learned about tense, unless you studied English either with some linguistics professor or learned it as a foreign language, most of what your English teachers told you about tense is not exactly correct. How many tenses do you remember English has? Maybe list the ones you remember. Okay. Okay. Anyone want to throw out any other tenses? 6. So I assume, Santolo, you're thinking past, present, future. And what are the other 3 you're thinking about? No, kitty, you cannot chew on my napkin. The cat is behind the monitor right now, trying to munch on the napkins I was using with dinner. Okay, so Santolo, so your 6 are past, present, future, and then the add the word perfect to the end of those. Okay. Okay. Kiwi has the vague sense that there are more but can't remember them. So what we're going to do is I'll reveal to you the quote unquote correct answer, although, you know, let's say correct might be a little bit absolute. Let's say the answer that has the most explanatory power. No, kitty, you cannot have my hamburger. I'm seeing from under the monitor this paw reaching out, trying to pat my plate. Like, give me the food. Okay, so let's start with the three basic tenses that everybody remembers. Let's put aside the whole perfect thing and anything that you have the vague senses out there. We'll come back to all of that. Let's just start with these basic ones that everybody's familiar with. We all agree that this is how you would name these. She rode the horse. Past tense, she rides the horse. Present tense, she will ride the horse. Future, right? The question I want us to explore is, I mean, this is the traditional thing. So what every school book tells you, it's inherited. Sneak it away, kitty. Yes. It's inherited from, yes, I was thinking about you, Bins, when I wrote those examples. I want us to reflect progressive. Okay, well, we're going to cover the progressive. The question is it a tense? So what it's part of the verb phrase, Kiwi. That much you got right. But we have to start with basics. Like, what do we mean by a tense, right? And how accurate is the traditional account of things, right? So let's check your intuition. I have, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples. In each of these, I have italicized one word. There are other verbs in many of these examples, but I want you to focus only on the italicized one. And I want you to think about the tense. Remember, I just gave you examples of the canonical tenses, past, present, and future, what the tense is. But I also want you to think about the time that this sentence refers to, right? So let's do it one sentence at a time. So for sentence number 1, the judge delivers her decision tomorrow. Tell me first the tense and then the time reference of this sentence. Yeah, the all of these examples, I will say, are completely standard English. There are no grammatical errors here, right? So Santolo, yes, the verb is a present tense verb, delivers. Remember, we saw she rides the horse. You all agreed that was present tense verb, right? The judge delivers. It's present tense verb, but very clearly the time is future. Okay. What about is in the second sentence? Again, tense and time. Yeah. So is a present tense verb, right? It is referring to future time. Yep. Present future. Okay. Now, the next one, a little bit trickier. Weeds. Again, I'll just say right out, since it has the same ending. That's present. Okay, so recurring is a good way to put it. Notice, even though we call this the present tense, this action can be a true statement, even if it's not currently Saturday, right? It's, this recurring, this habitual action that's being described, right? The time, it in a loose sense overlaps the present, but not in any kind of continuous sense, right? The weeding doesn't have to be occurring at the present moment for that to be a true statement, as long as it's sort of a punctual act that happens over and over again every Saturday, right? Now, this fourth one is even trickier in terms of the time. Again, we have says. It's another present tense verb, right? But think hard about the time that that verb refers to. We don't use this when the sister is saying this at the very moment that we're saying something, right? When was the speech act? Yeah, Mickey is right. Says is a present tense verb, but notice, logically speaking, the sister told me this thing in the past, and now I'm talking to you, and I'm saying, oh, your sister says blah, 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 right? The sister actually said it in the past, but we can use the present tense in this sort of context. So we have present tense, past time, right? Except it's not had one, it's have one, right? So we'll get to the have one. Now notice, this is one reason why I said there's more than one verb in here, and I want you to focus your attention on the one that I put in italics, right? Have one is referring to past time, right? But let me ask you this. I didn't italicize it, but what's the tense of have? Ignore the one, but just have on its own. What tenses have? Yep, that's exactly it. Have is a present tense verb. Had is with a D is the past tense equivalent, right? So it's not, so basically have is a present tense verb. We'll talk about this particular construction, have one and related ones, after I handle the basic issues of tense. You were looking at the next sentence. So missed is past. The regret will be in the future, right? But imagine the context that we're saying this. You and I are sitting on the couch watching a TV show, and Louise is not here with us. And I turn to you and say, because I know she loves this show, and I say, Louise will regret that she missed this show. When is the missing happening relative to when I'm saying that sentence? The regret is in the future, right? She's missing, yeah, she's missing the show right now at the moment that is being said. So in other words, we are using a past tense verb to describe a present time event, right? And then you looking ahead, looking at the next one, you might guess where this is going. Sold. What's the tense of that verb? Sold is a future verb, future tense verb. I'm not asking about the time, Mickey. Sell, sold. Yeah. Past, future. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So sold is a past tense verb, right? Um, However, you're absolutely correct. We're talking about an event which has not yet occurred. So we are using the past tense to talk about future time. Right? Because it's clearly next month's rent. The coin collection is not yet sold, and if it is sold, it will be used to pay the next month's rent. So all of the action here is he's one sad boy. Yes, exactly. All of the action here is future directed. I love this stuff too. Every one of these sentences is completely standard English. We use them all the time and don't really give it much thought, right? Now, what's going on here, right? Well, let's try to define our terms. What do we mean by tense? Longish definition. I'll read it out, then I'll explain it. A grammatical form, or system of forms, whose primary function is to refer to a point in time. Now, every bit of that definition is important, right? So, grammatical form, in other words, we have to be able to see it in a shape. It can be a set of forms. It can be related. It doesn't have to be one form for one tense. You can have a related, set of things, right? Its main function, not the only one, but its main function is to mark a point in time. So past tense usually refers to past time. But as we saw, it doesn't have to. There are circumstances where the tense can be used for other things. And as we also saw, like present tense for future time, for past time, like all of these permutations are possible. And so you may remember one of the things that I was urging on you early on is to keep clearly distinct form and function, right? Because the tense is a form. It's just a grammatical form. It has a characteristic function, but it can be put to other uses. If you try to make that equation and think that tense and time are just the same, two synonyms for the same thing, you will get yourself seriously messed up when it comes to trying to understand how all of this stuff works. Could be present if discussing with Bins, because Bins lives in the future. I love these examples because they always tend to blow people's minds, right? The time that we're talking about, this is just sort of a side note, but it's worth pointing out. In most cases, the time we're talking about is relative to the time that the sentence was uttered or, spoken or written. Utterance, by the way, is a term that linguists tend to use as a catch-all for any form of the language, whether it's spoken or written or signed, just anything. It's an utterance, right? Yep, we Cali folks, we are behind. No, Kai, you can't have any of that either. Sorry. So I am working on the presentation now. So that is relative to when I wrote that sentence, right? The present time, obviously, I'm no longer working on the presentation. I wrote it earlier today, but it was accurate relative then. But there are limited cases where the time is interpreted relative to when you read it, not when it's written. So imagine a sign. right? You are entering a secure area. Clearly, that does not refer to the time that that sentence was written. It's directly addressing somebody, right now. But that is a minority. That's not the most common way that we understand this. The default is it's always relative to the time of the utterance. Okay. Now, having shown you that tense and time are not the same thing, I now want to draw your attention to the oddity of will, right? When we looked at those three basic forms, right? So, say, he walks, he walked, he will walk, right? The things that you were all taught, past, present, and future, right? The will walk sort of stands out, right? That's the only one that's formed with a totally separate word, right? There are some other oddities about will. And the first one is this. What do you notice about the pattern of the verbs that are varying here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's not graduated in all of these. The graduation is in the future, right? If it's going to happen at all. It's a potential event, not an actual event, which is basically what we mean by the future, right? Everything in the future is all potentiality. Now, obviously, there are different shades of meaning here, right? They're not synonymous, but you have all these words, and the grammatical pattern is identical, right? Word plus graduate in infinitive form of the verb, then from blah blah blah. No changes there. They all refer to unrealized events. Why then are we singling out will as the future tense? Like, what are all these others? Why aren't they future tenses too? I don't expect that's a rhetorical question. I don't expect you to try to answer it. Just putting that thought in your head right now. Um, in addition to the fact that as you saw from those examples, will is only one option to talk about different kinds of possible events. It's not even always the normal way that we refer to future time. So suppose that a friend calls you up. Should an answer be that we learn it when we're little, it's easier for us to recognize a simple pattern. I mean, that could be, but of course, the question is, what do you mean by learning it when you're little? After all, you learn how to use will without ever, knowing what an auxiliary verb is or whatever. You listen to the language and you pick it up. Same thing for all the other structures. At some point, if you have the right schooling, somebody will tell you, "Oh, this is future tense," right? But they don't have to teach it to you that way. They could teach it to you differently, right? So that's if you say, I'll come back to your statement, Sintolo, and deal with that a little bit later. But it's again, we want to distinguish form and function. That's all I'll say about it now. If a friend calls you up and says, "Do you want to go see a movie tonight?" What would be the normal answer to decline? Which of these two would you be more likely to say? Mm-hmm. Everybody agrees. In other words, I will go to a party. Like, okay, so that's supposedly the simple future, but we don't use it. Welcome back, Shire. We don't use it in a situation like this. I am going to the party. Am present tense, right? In this case, we have a plan, and we don't say I will go to the party. Now, there, in what context can you invent a context where you might actually, where it might be sensible and natural to say A instead of B? Never. I mean, it might be hard to think of it off the top of your head. I can think of a few. I can see English learners, yeah, an English language learner, somebody who's not a native speaker, would be very likely to say A rather than B. But I'm asking, when might a native English speaker intuitively say it? Must you stay home tonight? Or some, yeah, that's kind of in the ballpark of what I was thinking. Imagine you're a rebellious teenager, and your mother says to you, "You, young woman, are grounded. You are not going anywhere." Right? And the rebellious teenager turns around and says, "Screw you, mom. I will go to the party no matter what you say." Right? The point there is, notice that will, when we say I will go to the party, you would use, if you use your common sense, yeah. I mean, even if you're not a native English speaker, if you are fluent enough in the language, you've been taught or you've heard enough people using I'm going rather than I will go, that you've internalized this distinction. Uh, um, the reason this is relevant is will here, if I say I will go to the party, that is far more than just a simple marker of future time. It conveys an element of, well, for lack of a better word, will, of intentionality. I will go. It's your determination to do something. So there's more going on with the verb there than simply marking future time. Right? Make the hubs leave the house. Fair enough. Fair enough. You will leave the house. You will do the chores. All right. Next question for you. This one's a little bit trickier. Your intuitions may not exactly align with each other, but I'm curious if you find some of these acceptable and some of these unacceptable. And by the way, in case you don't know, that, oh, it's Ayafyatla Yokut. Happy now, Bins? Ayafyatla Yokut. It's Icelandic, and the double L in Icelandic is the TL sound. Number 2 is not right. Okay. Four. Mm-hmm. Are you saying 4 is bad or good, Shirei? Like, you guys are all like 4-1. I don't know if you 4 is correct. Okay. I'm saying most acceptable because this is a subtle point, and not everybody is going to have, even if you're a native speaker, you might not have a strong intuition. This is certainly something like there's a official answer for standard written English that has a logic behind it. But I'm not going to go so far as to say that everybody's native spoken English maintains this exact distinction. Right? I'm just saying it's tricky because, like there is, like, again, relative to what you're supposed to write, there is an official answer as to what's right and wrong here. But when we're talking about spoken language, I'm asking for your intuition. That doesn't necessarily correspond with the writing. So for me, I will tell you that numbers 1 and 4 are good, are correct. And numbers 2 and 3 sound wrong. Okay? And what's the pattern here? Scientists say that Eyjafjallajökull will erupt soon. So say, present tense verb, will. Notice, say doesn't really go very well with would. Sound wrong, but are they? Well, depends on what standard we're using for correctness. In terms of like your intuition might give you a different answer from the formal written one. In this particular case, my intuition and the formal writing match, but I've been doing this long enough that I don't know. But anyway, in standard written English, 1 and 4 are correct. 2 and 3 are incorrect. Say goes with will. Said goes with would. Right? Say doesn't work with would. Said doesn't work with will. Okay. So will patterns with a present tense verb. Would patterns with a past tense verb. Okay. How can we explain? I've been just throwing out these different observations. The question is, how can we explain all of this? Right? Now, the simplest way to explain it is this. English has only 2 primary tenses, present and past. In other words, there is no evidence at all that the future exists as a tense in English. Uh-oh. I think that's on your side. It's still showing... Is anybody else having buffering problems? This is showing me as excellent on the... I'm not dropping any frames according to this. Okay. So yeah, only 2 primary tenses, present and past. In English, the future is a time. We have lots of different ways of talking about future time, but it is not a tense. And I will note in passing that this 2-tense system is shared by all Germanic languages. It's one of the diagnostic, or I mean, not diagnostic, but it's one of the really characteristic things that separates the Germanic languages from other Indo-European languages. They only have 2 morphologically distinct tenses. Okay? Now, this does not mean that there's no such thing as a future tense in any language. Latin has a future tense. Descending from Latin, the Romance languages, so Spanish, French, Italian, Romanian, they have future tenses, right? They actually do it. En français, right? Parlerai is I will speak, right? That's that ERAI, whatever ending, that is a future tense ending, a legitimate one, right? But there is no separate form to do the future tense as a separate tense. Hey, I told you when we started this, Sintolo, I said that a lot of what your English teachers taught you about tense in English was wrong, right? Etymologically speaking, you're going into the pool bins. Espèce de piscine. Something like that. How would you say fucking pool in French? I'm not totally sure. My French is not that good. So sorry, I lost the thread of what I was saying. Oh yeah. The historically, the reason why you're taught that there is a future tense is because when people sat down to write the first grammars of English, they came to it having studied Latin grammar, right? English grammar had never been written down, but Latin grammar has been studied for, at the time for like 2,000 years. So people just borrowed the categories from Latin, even when they don't really apply all that well. So, yeah. Now, and I already said that we have many ways of referring to time. That's back. Let's see. The so. Yeah, when so is in chat, I tend to say so a lot as a discourse marker. SO as a discourse marker. So when I'm talking to so, you get a lot of so's in a row. Like so. I mean, I should, I suppose, if I'm really careful, pronounce the T in front of the S. As an English speaker, I always leave that out. Just like psychology, right? That P disappears, or pterodactyl, the P disappears. But, in the original, in Greek, you would pronounce it. Even in French, right? The French say psychologie. Oh my goodness, Bins. Big storms there, huh? Be safe. Let's hope there's no trees coming down on you. Pterodactyl lost you spelling bee. I was always a terrible speller, which is ironic, I suppose. Maybe ironic considering how much I like language, but go figure. That's what we have devices for, Bins, just to correct our spelling. As long as you can look at it and not get sucked in by the homophones, you're good. If you can't, or if you don't bother to proofread, then you get the sort of thing like the impotence of proofreading. You guys, are you familiar with that? I've mentioned it. I've definitely mentioned it. But huh, so yeah, I won't play it again right now. But if any of you are unfamiliar with it, it's a spoken word poem by Taylor Molly. You can find it on YouTube. It's very very funny.